I've spent the better part of 18 years sitting beside people over 60, and often far beyond that. Sometimes in hospice rooms, sometimes in quiet parks, sometimes across a kitchen table with a notebook and a cup of tea. I didn't always speak much. Often, I was just there to listen. And one thing I heard again and again in so many different forms was this: "I'm just so tired. And I don't know why." Not tired from a walk. Not the kind that a nap fixes. This was something deeper, like their body and their spirit had grown quiet all at once. What surprised me most wasn't the tiredness itself. It was how many people assumed it was normal, that it was simply part of the aging process. "Well, I'm old, so of course I'm tired," they'd say, shrugging, smiling softly. But over time, I learned that age isn't always the cause, and tiredness isn't always something we just have to accept. What follows isn't a lecture. It's a quiet offering. A few patterns I've seen, 6 specifically, that often live beneath this exhaustion. Some are physical, some emotional, some hidden in plain sight, but all of them, I believe, are worth noticing with kindness. One of the first things I began to notice in the people I worked with, especially those living alone after 60, was how hydration became less intuitive. It's a small detail, easy to overlook, but again and again, I'd see it. Cracked lips, dry skin, lightheaded spells. A client named Harold, 72, living alone, mostly independent, would often nod off during our sessions. Not out of boredom. He'd just drift, gently, mid-sentence. He wasn't on sedatives. He wasn't sleep-deprived. He was simply dehydrated. When I asked what he drank in a typical day, he said, "I have coffee in the morning and a bit of juice at lunch. No water? Well," he said, "I don't want to be running to the bathroom every hour. This is more common than you'd think." After 60, the body's natural thirst signal weakens. It doesn't sound the alarm the way it used to. So unless we're intentional, we begin to run on empty. Not drastically, but enough to fog the mind, slow the blood, and dull the spark. For Harold, the change came not from force but from routine. We put a small glass of water beside his reading chair, another near the sink, just enough to remind him. Within a few weeks, he reported fewer nodding off moments and a little more clarity in the mornings. Not every tiredness is caused by dehydration, but for many, it's the easiest one to begin addressing gently without fear. Another quiet culprit I saw far too often was something I came to call stillness fatigue. There's this paradox that appears after retirement, especially when someone transitions from a structured life to a quieter one. You'd think less physical activity would lead to more rest, but often the opposite happens. I once worked with a woman named Marla. She'd been a teacher for 40 years, organized, thoughtful, a true matriarch of her community. But a year after retiring at 66, she told me she felt more exhausted than ever. "I barely do anything," she said. "And yet, I feel like I've run a marathon by 4 p.m. When I asked about her daily rhythm, she said most of her day was spent sitting, reading, watching shows, crosswords, all things she enjoyed. But her body had stopped moving with purpose. And when movement slows to a crawl, so does the circulation, the oxygen flow, the alertness, the joy. Her body began to interpret stillness as shutdown. We started small. A timer every hour. 2 minutes of standing. A stretch. A walk around the house. Within a month, she didn't feel young again, but she felt present. Awake in a way she hadn't for years. Stillness is not rest. Rest replenishes. Stillness, when prolonged, quietly drains. The third pattern I began to notice was harder to name at first. It wasn't physical. It wasn't even something people said out loud. It was a kind of background hum, a tension that lived in the body long before it reached the voice. Silent stress. A man I supported, Tom, once told me, "I've got nothing to be stressed about. I'm retired. Bills are paid. I live near my grandkids. So why do I feel so uneasy all the time?" I asked him to write down what he worried about. Not in the dramatic sense, but the small things that woke him at 3 a.m. or hovered over breakfast. His list was long. What if I forget something important? What if my heart medication stops working? What if I become a burden? None of these were loud fears. They didn't interrupt his day, but they lived beneath the surface, whispering, tightening his shoulders, clouding his sleep, draining him slowly. We called them his background worries, and just naming them helped. Once a week, he'd choose one and talk it through with me.
No fixing.
Just airing it out. And slowly, the tiredness lifted. Not gone, but gentler. Like removing pebbles from his shoes, one by one. There's a certain kind of tiredness that doesn't show up in blood tests or sleep studies. I saw it first in a man named Elias, age 68. He came to our sessions not because of illness, but because, in his words, I don't feel like myself anymore. He wasn't in pain. He wasn't grieving. He wasn't lonely in the traditional sense. But his days had grown flat, monochrome. We talked for several weeks before he said something that stayed with me. I wake up, I eat, I watch a little TV, but nothing really asks anything of me anymore. I don't have a reason to get up. I just do. That kind of fatigue is tied to meaning. Not the kind found in grand gestures or achievements, but the quiet kind. The kind that comes from being needed, included, engaged. After 60, especially after retirement or after children leave home, many people lose the outer structures that once gave shape to their energy. When that scaffolding falls away, the body can interpret the stillness as an invitation to shut down. And that can look like tiredness. But what it often is purposelessness, quietly asking for a new form. With Elias, we found small ways to re-anchor his days. Mentoring a teenager in his neighborhood who shared his love of jazz, starting a journal to document his father's old stories, calling his sister each Sunday without fail. They weren't revolutionary, but they reminded him that his presence still mattered, to others, and to himself. Energy follows meaning, not the other way around. Another pattern I saw, one that took time to fully understand, was the role of food. Not just what was being eaten, but when and why. Many older adults I worked with fell into patterns of eating that looked fine on the surface. Toast for breakfast, soup for lunch, maybe a soft dinner and tea. But when we looked closer, the meals were often missing the very things the aging body needs most. Protein, healthy fats, fiber. One woman I worked with, Rosalind, age 73, told me she was doing everything right. She followed the guidelines from a decades-old pamphlet, avoided fats, kept her meals light, but she napped constantly and often felt faint in the afternoons. A dietitian friend reviewed her meals and pointed out the obvious. She was underfeeding her system, not in quantity but in quality. Her body was running on simple carbs with no staying power. The result? A roller coaster of blood sugar spikes and crashes that looked and felt like exhaustion. We worked slowly, adding avocado here, boiled eggs there, small handfuls of almonds, salmon when she could find it fresh. It wasn't about becoming a nutrition expert. It was about listening to what her body actually needed now, not what it used to need decades ago. Within a few weeks, the naps became optional instead of necessary. Her skin brightened. She laughed more easily. All because her body had fuel again. Food isn't just fuel. It's medicine, it's memory, and in older age, it's often a quiet call for attention. One that deserves more care than most of us were taught to give it. Then there was sleep. Sleep in older adults is often misunderstood, even by the medical world. A good number of the people I worked with said things like, I sleep 8 hours a night, but I wake up feeling wrecked. Or, I go to bed early, stay in bed all night, but I'm still dragging by noon. Sleep is not just about how long you're in bed. It's about what kind of sleep you're getting. Deep sleep, the restorative kind that clears the brain, heals the body and stores memory, becomes harder to reach with age. Light dozing, frequent waking, or tossing between shallow dreams can leave a person more tired than when they laid down. One client, Helen, age 70, had the habit of falling asleep with the TV on. It comforts me, she said. The voices make the house feel less empty. I didn't argue, but I gently suggested we try something different, a soft white noise machine, and a dim, warm light on a timer. She called me a week later and said, I had dreams, real dreams. I haven't dreamed in years. That moment told me everything. We can't control everything about sleep, especially as we age. pain, medications, and anxiety can interfere, but we can create an environment where the body feels safe enough to truly rest. And in older adults, that can make all the difference. If you're still here, feel free to leave your thoughts below. I read each one with care. You never know who might feel seen by what you share. Not all fatigue comes from inside the body. Some of it comes from the weight we carry without even realizing it. There's a kind of emotional fatigue I've seen in many older adults, particularly those who've spent a lifetime caring for others, showing up, being dependable. They reach a stage, often sometime after 60, when the world goes quiet, and suddenly all that emotion they postponed for years begins to rise. I met a retired nurse named Jean, 69, who told me she was exhausted all the time, not just physically, but in her spirit. She described it as a kind of soft drowning, like moving through heavy water. She wasn't grieving anything recent, no new diagnosis, but she said, "I think my body's finally catching up to the decades I ignored it." She had raised 4 children while working double shifts at the hospital, supported a husband through cancer, buried her mother, and still made dinner every Sunday for her family. Her body had survived, but her soul hadn't quite caught up. We started with silence. Not meditation necessarily, just moments of deliberate stillness where she didn't need to be anything for anyone. No performing, no fixing, just listening inward. Over time, Jean discovered that part of her tiredness wasn't a lack of energy. It was years of unprocessed emotion finally surfacing. And instead of running from it, she made space for it. She took up painting again, messy, abstract swirls of feeling on canvas. Not for show, just for her. She said, "It's the first time I've let myself express something I didn't have words for." And with that came lightness, not euphoria, but relief. Emotional fatigue after 60 is real, especially for those who've lived decades in survival mode. We can't just snap out of it, but we can make room to release it in gentle, consistent ways. There's also another overlooked factor I've seen, and this one often hides behind polite smiles and perfectly organized pill boxes. Medication overload. After 60, prescriptions tend to pile up. A pill for cholesterol, one for blood pressure, another to help you sleep, then something to counteract the side effects of the last one. Over time, I've seen people take 7, 10, even 15 medications daily. The problem isn't always the medications themselves. Many are necessary, life-extending. The issue is that they don't always work well together, and no one's checking often enough. A man named Leonard, 74, came to me because he was sleeping almost 14 hours a day. His doctor told him it was just age, but something didn't sit right with him. He felt foggy, not just tired. I encouraged him to ask for a full medication review, not just from his GP, but from a pharmacist trained in geriatric care. The result? 2 of his medications were interacting in a way that lowered his sodium levels, not dangerously, but enough to cause mental fog, lethargy, and imbalance. After an adjustment, Leonard's energy didn't come rushing back like magic. But slowly, his clarity returned. He began walking again. He started writing short letters to his grandchildren, something he hadn't had the motivation to do in years. Medication fatigue is real, but because it often comes on gradually, it's easy to blame it on aging itself. That's why I always encourage older adults to revisit their medications yearly, not with fear, but with curiosity. Could this be part of the fog I'm feeling? Is a question worth asking. There's one more kind of fatigue I feel compelled to speak about. It's not physical, not emotional, not even spiritual. It's existential. It's the kind of tiredness that comes when a person feels, quietly, painfully, that they've outlived their usefulness. I've seen this more times than I can count. A sharp, once active elder begins to withdraw. Not because they're ill, but because something inside has gone dim. They no longer feel needed, no longer feel invited into life. A woman named June, bright eyes, sharp mind, lived alone after her partner passed. Told me over tea, "I don't know what I'm supposed to do anymore. The world doesn't need me like it used to. I'm just here." And that kind of just here feeling is heavier than it looks. We started with one small shift. Every Saturday, she wrote a letter to her niece's child. a child who lived states away and had never met her. She wrote stories from her childhood, bits of wisdom, even recipes. Over time, her letters became something cherished in that little girl's home. And June began to feel something she hadn't felt in years. Purpose. It didn't erase her grief, but it reminded her that her voice still mattered, that her existence could ripple outward in soft, meaningful ways. After 60, many people aren't tired because their body is failing. They're tired because the world has stopped asking them to contribute. And when no one asks, we often forget that we still can. There's something else I learned, not from textbooks, but from hours spent in living rooms and long-term care facilities, listening to the rhythms of daily life in older age. Sometimes the tiredness isn't from a lack of strength, but from a lack of joy. It sounds soft, almost too gentle to be a real factor. But in truth, I believe it's one of the most powerful undercurrents of fatigue I've witnessed after 60. And the heartbreaking part is that no one talks about it. Joy fades quietly. It doesn't slam the door on its way out. It slips away during long winters, missed phone calls, holidays that feel a little emptier than they used to. Over time, what used to be laughter becomes a polite smile. What used to be anticipation becomes routine. I remember working with a man named Walter. He was 76, sharp-minded, articulate, and well cared for. No major health issues. His adult children visited often. By all measures, he was fine. And yet, he described his life like this: "I'm surviving just fine, but I don't feel alive anymore." When I asked what used to make him feel that way, truly alive, he paused for a long time. Then he said, "I used to sing in a barbershop quartet. I haven't sung in 20 years. There wasn't a dramatic reason why he stopped. Life got busy. The group disbanded. He moved. And the years quietly carried that part of him away." We talked about what singing had meant to him, the connection, the harmony, the way his chest would buzz with the deep bass notes. He lit up just remembering. And that's when I knew the tiredness he carried wasn't about age. It was about disconnection from something essential. So we found a local community choir. Not barbershop, not formal, just a handful of people gathering once a week to sing old folk songs in someone's basement. He was nervous the first time, said he felt rusty. But the moment he sang his first note, he cried. It wasn't just about the music. It was about being himself again, not just a version shaped by age or responsibility. I saw a noticeable shift in Walter after that. He still moved slowly, still took his afternoon naps, but there was light in him again. The kind of light that makes you lean forward when you talk. When joy goes missing, so does vitality. When we find it again, even in small, silly, unpolished ways, the body responds. That's something no pill can replicate. But not everyone can go join a choir. That's not the point. The point is this: what once made you feel alive? And when was the last time you touched it? Sometimes it's music. Sometimes it's painting or puzzles or prayer. Sometimes it's baking your mother's old recipe, even if you burn it. Sometimes it's volunteering, storytelling, feeding the birds, walking through your childhood neighborhood on Google Maps. Whatever it is, when you reconnect with it, the tiredness may not disappear, but it often rearranges itself. It becomes softer, more understandable, less consuming. And if joy is the soul's nourishment, then presence is the daily vitamin most of us forget. I've seen people feel exhausted from living entirely in memory, or entirely in fear of what's to come. The what-ifs about health, money, loneliness, memory loss, they can drain someone faster than any disease. A woman I worked with, Marjorie, had just turned 70. She told me she spent hours each day Googling symptoms. Every ache, every twitch. She'd research until she convinced herself something was terribly wrong. "I'm so tired," she said, "but I can't stop." We worked on grounding techniques. Nothing fancy. Just small, physical cues to bring her back to the present. Feeling her feet on the floor. Holding a warm mug and really noticing its weight. Naming 5 things she could see in the room. Writing a sentence that began with "right now These weren't meant to fix everything, but they helped her remember. She was still here, still breathing, still alive today. Presence is not denial. It's an act of noticing what is real, not imagined, not replayed, not feared in this very moment. And for many older adults, it becomes a source of strength they didn't know they had. Which brings me to something I say often to families, caregivers, and those who love someone over 60. Tiredness is information. It's not always a problem to fix. Sometimes it's a message to interpret. When someone says, "I'm tired," it might mean, "I'm lonely but don't want to burden anyone. I miss being needed. I haven't laughed in weeks. I'm overwhelmed but don't have words for it. I feel invisible in a world that moves too fast." When we hear these deeper messages, we can respond with care instead of correction, with curiosity instead of assumptions, with companionship instead of advice. And when someone feels seen, sometimes, just sometimes, that's the beginning of real rest. One of the quietest truths I've learned from spending time with older adults is this: fatigue isn't always a condition. Sometimes it's a language. It's the body's way of saying, "Please listen to me differently now." It's the spirit's way of asking, "Is there still something that makes me feel alive?" And it's the heart's way of whispering, "I miss being seen." When you begin to look at tiredness that way, not as failure but as information, something opens. You stop asking, "What's wrong with me?" and start wondering, "What have I been ignoring?" And in that wondering, there's possibility. The 6 reasons I've shared: hydration, stillness, emotional weight, poor nutrition, loss of purpose, and silent overmedication, they don't cover everything. They never could. Each person holds a different combination of stories, regrets, chemistry, and longing. But they are starting points. They are doors that we too often leave closed, because we're told that feeling this way is just part of aging. I don't believe that's the whole story. Yes, the body changes. Yes, things slow down. But exhaustion, the kind that dulls the spark in your eyes and makes each day feel heavier than it should, that kind of tiredness deserves more compassion, more curiosity, more care. If you or someone you love has been saying, "I'm just tired," for months or years, consider gently asking, when did you last feel truly rested? What does joy look like for you now? Is there something you miss doing? Even if it's been a long time? Sometimes the answers are quiet. Sometimes there are tears. But almost always, there is something that stirs. And that stirring? That's where healing begins. I've seen people come back to themselves in the smallest ways. A man who started writing postcards to his old army buddy. A woman who danced alone in her living room to 1940s jazz. A retired accountant who joined a local birdwatching group and found friends he didn't know he needed. A grandmother who began recording stories into a voice memo app for her great-grandchildren to hear one day. These are not fixes. They are invitations. And the body responds to invitation far better than instruction. So if you're feeling tired, deeply, persistently tired, try not to judge it. Try not to rush to fix it. Instead, be curious. What has gone silent in you? What part of you is asking to be included again? What nourishment, movement, presence, or connection might feel like medicine now, even if it didn't before? None of us were taught how to grow older. We're figuring it out as we go, each with our own aches, our own wonderings, our own quiet hopes. But I do believe this: the tiredness we feel doesn't mean we're finished. It means we're adjusting. And maybe, just maybe, we're being asked to slow down long enough to rediscover what still matters. If this kind of quiet reflection feels helpful to you, you're welcome to come back anytime. I'll be here,